What are invasive alien species? Well, it depends on who you ask. I'm going to look at what two different organizations that deal with nature conservation say they are. The Convention on Biological Diversity says that invasive alien species are species whose introduction and or spread outside their natural past or present distribution threatens biological diversity. And these invasive alien species can be animals, plants, fungi, and microorganisms like bacteria. So let's see how that definition works out for one very common non-native species found in Ireland. Solanum tuberosum is a non-native species grown in Ireland. It's got quite pretty flowers, but it's probably its tubers that it's mostly grown for. It's the potato. The potato is originally from Peru and parts of northern Bolivia in South America, but now it's managed to make its way all over the world. In China, nearly 100 million metric tons of potatoes are harvested every year. India is in second place with nearly 50 million tons per year. Russia, nearly 30 million. And in 30th place, Denmark with just over 2 million. So then the potato has definitely been introduced or spread outside its natural past or present distribution. But does it threaten biological diversity? I'll let you have a think about that one. And for those of you who are wondering, Ireland produces about 455,000 tons of potatoes per year. The International Union for Conservation of Nature says invasive alien species are species that are introduced accidentally or intentionally outside of their natural geographic range, and they become problematic in the places where they're introduced. So both of those definitions have one thing in common. Invasive species are species that have been introduced somehow outside of where they would naturally be found. Now, the Convention on Biological Diversity says that these invasive alien species threaten biodiversity where they're introduced, while the IUCN just says that they become problematic. So if we go with the IUCN definition, then maybe the potato's off the hook, which is a good thing because I like chips. Over the past 6,000 years, we've introduced a lot of plants for food and for our gardens. Over 2,000 plant species have been recorded in Ireland, and about two-thirds of those are not native. They were introduced, but only about 60 of those plant species are currently a problem. Invasive alien species are alien because they've been introduced to places that are outside of their natural geographic range, and they become problematic in the places they're introduced to. Well, what kind of problems do they cause? Like other organizations around the world, the EU has a lot of rules to try to manage the problems that can be caused by invasive alien species. One of those rules, to do with the prevention and management of the introduction and spread of invasive alien species, says that invasive alien species have a negative impact on biodiversity, on native species, on the structure and functioning of ecosystems, and on the transmission of diseases, as well as social and economic impacts, and in some cases they can have a significant negative impact on human health. The Convention on Biological Diversity says that invasive alien species are a direct driver of biodiversity loss around the world. Based on information it gathered from governments all around the world, an organization called IPBES puts invasive alien species on its list of the top 5 things that have a negative impact on nature on the planet. So what are these invasive alien species in Ireland, and what do they look like? Well, in the European Communities Birds and Natural Habitats Regulations 2011, right near the end, in the third schedule, there's a list of invasive alien species that the regulations were set up to deal with. There's about 78 species listed in total, and the regulations also deal with vector material. An example of vector material would be soil taken from places infested with the invasive alien plant species Japanese knotweed. For many people, when they think of invasive alien species, the first species they think of is Japanese knotweed. And as is the case with other invasive alien species, very often the common name is a clue that a species has been introduced outside of its natural geographic range. Another place to find out about invasive alien species in Ireland is on the website of the National Biodiversity Data Centre, and they've rated species according to whether they think they would have a high impact or a medium impact on native biodiversity. This would include some species that are found on the third schedule of the regulations, but also some species that aren't. These invasive alien species showed up in data I downloaded from the National Biodiversity Data Centre when I was researching for the Community Foundation for Ireland Biodiversity Action Plan for Ballincollig. The National Biodiversity Data Centre gives each species a score so they can figure out which are the high impact and which are the medium impact species. I must admit I was quite surprised to find that the brown rat had been given the highest invasive score for all the invasive alien species recorded in Ballincollig. The brown rat can have negative impacts on native animals and plants, as well as human health. For ground nesting birds, especially on islands, it can cause local extinctions, but you're usually more likely to find it in urban areas like towns and cities. It's probably been in Ireland since the 17th century, and it's thought to originally have come from China, although that's not 100% certain. Another mammal on the list, the American mink, is also a problem for ground nesting birds and also for native mammals. I'm going to talk about the next two species together. So on the left, we've got Japanese knotweed. Down below is Bohemian knotweed. And on the right, we've got giant knotweed. Now that species hasn't been recorded so far in Ballincollig. Now the reason I've included giant knotweed is because Japanese knotweed and giant knotweed are species, while Bohemian knotweed is not a species. It's a hybrid. It's a hybrid between Japanese knotweed and giant knotweed. So Japanese knotweed is native in Japan, but also China and Korea. It was brought to Europe in the early to mid-19th century. All plants of Japanese knotweed in the wild in Europe are thought to be female. They can't produce seed, so all spread is vegetative. A small piece of the leaf or stem can easily grow into an entirely new plant. All plants of Japanese knotweed in the wild in the UK are thought to be clones of a single plant that was introduced in the 19th century. Japanese knotweed is related to our native docks. Some think that the hybrid Bohemian knotweed could be more invasive than its parents, the Japanese and giant knotweeds. A lot of Bohemian knotweed in Ireland has probably been mistaken for Japanese knotweed, so there's probably a lot more here than we think. Here are maps for current records of all three. Their fast-growing underground rhizomes means they can quickly take over an area, leaving little space for native plant species. Along riverbanks, when they die back in winter, because there's hardly any native vegetation left, soil from the bank is easily washed into rivers, which can be a problem for plants and animals in them. Another invasive alien plant species in Ballincollig is Himalayan Bolson. It flowers between June and October and produces seeds in capsules that burst open and scatter seed. Up to 800 seeds can be produced by each plant. This means it can quickly spread and take over an area, and when they grow along riverbanks, when they die back, because there's hardly any native vegetation, soil from the riverbank is easily washed into rivers, so it's a similar problem to Japanese knotweed. It was introduced in the 19th century. It's native in the Himalaya mountains in Asia. It was introduced as a garden plant, but also became popular with beekeepers because it produces quite a lot of nectar. The non-native winter heliotrope flowers early in the year and is useful for bees emerging from hibernation. Unlike Japanese knotweed and Himalayan balsam, at the moment there are no laws covering this plant. It was introduced in the 19th century and is originally from around the Mediterranean. In Ireland, all plants are male, and it's spread around the country by fragments of the plant. It develops a network of underground rhizomes, which means it can quickly take over an area. Winter heliotrope is in the same family as the dandelion and daisy. There is one more plant that wasn't flagged as an invasive in data from the National Biodiversity Data Centre, and that's the garden yellow archangel. Now, its potential risk of invasiveness was assessed, but it was only assessed as being of low impact. It's not covered by legislation in Ireland, but in the UK it's illegal to plant it or otherwise allow it to grow in the wild. The garden yellow archangel is actually a subspecies of an incredibly rare native plant. The garden yellow archangel cultivar can form dense carpets and totally exclude native vegetation, which is why it's covered by legislation in the UK. People only started to record it in Ireland in the late 1980s, although it was probably here before then, and even at that point it was quite widespread in Cork. And today there are far more records for it across the island of Ireland. It grows quite extensively in some wooded areas in the Ballincollig Regional Park, which is a bit of a worry because there's such a very nice native ground flora in the woodlands.